Lecture 25 today, we're going to continue with the Jacksonian era. This is a very busy time in American history. A lot of events of some significance are going to take place here. In this session, I want to talk about the Nullification crisis. Context for this would be, where does the power lie in the United States? Does it lie at the federal level or does it lie at the state level? This, of course, is the continuing argument. We see this going back to Hamilton and Jefferson, and we see it in our own time. Another context, of course, is the tariff. The nullification crisis is a threatened attempt by South Carolina to nullify federal law. So the tariff, again, is a long-running issue in United States history, and we see it emerge here in its most dangerous form. Significance: the nullification crisis is a precursor to the Civil War. It takes place 30 years before the Civil War, in the early 1830s. But it is a sort of preview of coming attractions, of something we're going to see in another generation. You might say it's a rehearsal for secession. And of course, South Carolina will be the first state to secede in 1860 after the election of Abraham Lincoln. Another significance, and this is a word you're going to hear a lot over the rest of the semester, and that is sectionalism. The country is breaking into two sections, southern and northern sections. We're going to emphasize this word as we go forward. This crisis is going to pit two strongly willed men against each other, President Andrew Jackson and his former Vice President, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. I'm going to briefly characterize these two men for you. We talked about Andrew Jackson presiding over a time of a rising suffrage in the United States as virtually all white men gained the vote or gained the right to vote. An era of, on the one hand, laissez-faire. Jackson, very much in the line of Jeffersonian thought here, wants to keep government limited, but at the same time you have, during the Jacksonian time, the American system emerging, whereby the government is aiding in the expansion of commerce in the country with internal improvements and transportation revolution that we've already talked about. Jackson, of course, was also born in South Carolina, a self-made man of the frontier, lived most of his life in Tennessee. Jackson reflects all the different shades of being an American. He's a debtor and a creditor, was born in poor circumstances but became a lawyer and a wealthy man. He's both a Democrat and an aristocrat, a rough aristocrat, but one nonetheless. A great failure and a great success. He suffered bankruptcy. He was a planter. So here's a man with a great deal of life experience who could see both sides of public issues. Of course, he emerged from the War of 1812 as a national hero due to his success at the Battle of New Orleans, and then, of course, his ongoing battles with the Indians in the southeast of the United States. He had carried forth the ideas of Jefferson, took them very seriously, ongoing battles with the Bank of the United States, and we're going to see here in the nullification crisis Jackson's character emerge again. Now, John C. Calhoun, his opponent, is the foremost advocate of the antebellum South, of the slave society that existed in the southern United States. He is the foremost representative of the planter interest in the Congress. I want to emphasize that the nullification crisis is a crisis about the tariff. It's not about slavery. The crisis over slavery will emerge in the next generation. Calhoun defended slavery as a positive good for both black and whites. This goes to paternalism, the notion that blacks are better off as slaves here in the United States than they would be as free men back in their own African societies. And we'll talk more about paternalism. John C. Calhoun did not want the South to leave the United States. He wanted the South to continue to dominate the United States. And this is a point that I don't think we reflect on very often. We talked last time about the New England states and their at least discussion of secession toward the end of the War of 1812. You remember the Hartford Convention, where the New England delegates gathered at Hartford, Connecticut, and aired their grievances. Think about this for a moment. The first president of the United States is George Washington, a Virginia planter, served 2 terms. Second president is John Adams from Massachusetts, served 1 term. Third president, Thomas Jefferson, a Virginia planter. Fourth president, James Madison, a Virginia planter. Fifth president, James Monroe, a Virginia planter, all these men serving 2 terms. You can see that the early republic is dominated by these Virginia farmers. And New England gets the sense, I believe, by the War of 1812, that they're living in the wrong country and that perhaps they should form their own nation as their interest and culture differ dramatically from the southern states. So Calhoun is not looking to secede from the Union. He's looking for continued southern dominance of the Union. Now, let's get to the nullification crisis in South Carolina. It's called the Tariff of Abominations, a rather dramatic way of putting it. The South Carolinians object to the tariff because it raises the prices of imported goods. And we know that the tariff is instituted to protect northern domestic manufacturing. So again, this points to the different sections, north and south, having different economic interest. Calhoun, like Jefferson, objects to the idea that the federal government can use its power to enhance one economic sector, in this case industry, over another, in this case agriculture. In November of 1832, South Carolina passed the Nullification Ordinance, which prohibited the collection of duties within the state. It forbade appeal to the Supreme Court, those cases arising from the Nullification Ordinance, asserted that the use of force by the federal government would be cause for secession, and made provisions authorizing the raising of military force and appropriations for arms. This is serious business. If states' rights are going to prevail, then presumably South Carolina has the right to do this. If the federal Constitution is going to prevail, then the federal government has the right to stop it. So you can see that we're headed for trouble here. And Jackson, in fact, had anticipated this trouble. Just prior to the Nullification Ordinance, Jackson ordered the Secretary of War to ready the forts in Charleston Harbor and began mobilizing troops to put down this incipient rebellion. In December of 1832, Jackson issued his proclamation to the people of South Carolina. This may be the most important document of the Jacksonian era. The proclamation characterized nullification as an impractical absurdity and asserted the supremacy of a sovereign and indivisible federal government. No state could refuse to obey the laws of the land, and no state could leave the Union. Jackson finished by threatening or warning that disunion by armed force is treason, and we know the price for treason. The crisis will be resolved without war and without secession. The threat, Jackson's threat of force, I think, frightened the South Carolinians. They didn't call him Old Hickory for nothing. People knew that he was irascible in his temperament, and I believe he threatened to go to South Carolina personally and hang every legislator there that threatened secession. So how was this crisis resolved? 1 week after issuing his proclamation, Jackson ordered the Secretary of State to report on how quickly arms and troops could be gathered to, quote, crush the monster in its cradle. South Carolina governor ordered state militia to train at home as their presence in Charleston might be provocative. Compromise is now going to go into action. In January 1833, the South Carolinians suspended their ordinance of nullification, thereby taking back the threat of leaving the country. As a face-saving gesture, South Carolina adopted an ordinance declaring Jackson's force bill null and void. The South Carolinians did get a little bit of a break here in that they, the tariff there was lowered somewhat. So there's a bit of a compromise here, but I don't think there's any doubt that Andrew Jackson's threat of force through his so-called force bill was the decisive factor here. So to take away from the nullification crisis, I think it's important to understand that this anticipates a much greater crisis that will occur in the fall of 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln. And again, you'll notice that it's South Carolina in 1860 that leads the southern states into secession. You might ask why. South Carolina, I heard one historian say, let's see, how did he put it? South Carolina was too small for a country, but too large for an insane asylum. Why is South Carolina so jumpy? South Carolina's demography is a little different from the other states in that there are more African American slaves in the state of South Carolina than there are free whites. I think the presence of this very large number of slaves makes South Carolina, the population in general, and the political leaders a little bit anxious and very wary of enhanced federal power that might dictate to them how to handle the racial issues there or slavery in general. So think of this as not the beginning, but certainly a significant episode of sectionalism in United States history, where North and South begin to break apart. So we're going to end nullification there, and we'll pick up with more Jacksonian episodes in the next lecture. Thank you.